Hi and welcome back to the channel. In this episode of our WRX rally car shed build, I'm going to get stuck into sorting out the steering rack and getting that in the car, power steering pump. All right, let's get going. Okay, from when I started recording a little while ago, received a package in the mail, and what I've done is this is a version 1 intercooler or version 2 intercooler, which has got the blow-off valve connection on the inlet pipe. The later model intercoolers to this are a slightly different shape and have blow-off valve in different locations and bits and pieces. So having had some experience with this type of intercooler and this version 1, version 2 setup back in the day, I know that these plastic ribs here on this intercooler pipe tend to crack, and then you lose boost and dust and dirt can get in. So preempting that, I wanted to get a silicone hose to go on here. I know they're commonly available for the later model WRX intercoolers. So I ordered one off eBay, and to make sure that things were right, it was actually listed as a 93 to 96 intercooler hose, and the picture didn't look right. So I actually contacted them before I bought it, and I said, listen, is this particular hose for a 93, for a version 1 WRX? And they replied back and said, yes, it is. And I said, okay, as long as you're 100% sure, I'll order it. And so this is what has arrived. Now, I don't know what drugs these people are taking, but it doesn't matter which way you look at it, that is not the correct silicone hose for this intercooler, for a version 1, so 93 to 96 intercooler. So now this evening I will take photos of that and have to send that back to those people. I'll get onto them and say, listen, you've sent me the wrong ones, please send me the correct ones, or give me a refund. Anyway, we'll keep pushing on. The steering rack, I'm just going to change the boots on this because they are a bit sad. I don't know if you can see that from the camera, but that one's split there, and at this end here, this one has also got a split in it. So lucky I grabbed a couple of boots. This is not a hard job to do, even on the car. They're pretty straightforward. However, while I've got it out, I will change that and get rid of these boots. Make sure that I've got the right size spanners there. They're usually 17 on the nut and a 19 on the actual tie rod end. It'll come apart. Now the trick with these is to count how many times they spin. So line that up. 16, almost there. 17. And that's about the average, is usually about 17 turns each side. I think we'll get some penetrating oil on that before we get that nut off. The car will still need wheel aligning when I put it back together. However, it will allow me to get a rough centering of the rack, and I mean, we've got to center it up, the steering column and everything, when we get that far with it. The rack itself didn't look like it was leaking any power steering fluid, which is great. There's a lot of oil in it. I gave it a bit of a quick degrease yesterday, or a couple of days ago when I got it back, and I'll do the same again. Yep, it's got grease in it. The rack's in good condition. There's no rattle in that, and actually the rod ends are actually in good shape on this too. There's no movement in either of the tie rods. Sorry, the tie rods. I've got no movement in them, which is great. They're nice and tight. It could be that somebody's done those. We'll find out when I get this boot off. And I will spray both ends of that. Yep, as you can see, that's got a fair split in it there. It's very common for these things to split. This has definitely had a rack end put in it at some point. That's nice and tight. We'll get a new one over that. These things are not very expensive. They're like 10 or 12 bucks each or something. Cable ties inside the boot. Don't make the mistake of putting the boot on and then wondering how you're going to fix it, and you've got cable ties jammed up in there. Seen that a couple of times, had cars come in and then, what's going on here? The rack's all jammed up, taken the boot off and found broken cable tie jammed inside the rack in here. Somebody's changed the boot, forgotten the cable ties are in there. Okay, pretty straightforward on these. It's not a lot to putting a rack boot on. Just make sure it's up on its groove. Okay, I won't lock those up, we'll just leave it loose. That's one done. Right, that's the rack pretty much ready to go back in. So the last episode I talked about needing to change the power steering pumps over. This is the 98 pump that came with the car initially. Just get this into a few components. I gave it a bit of a degrease. It was fairly covered in oil, which is a telltale sign that this seal here is leaking. It's very common. Right, okay. Before we get onto the pump, have a look at the lines. Straight up, we've got a bit of a drama there. That is the return line that has been chopped for some reason. So I'll have to see if I've got a spare return line. Worst case scenario, I can cut the metal pipe here and here, flare it, put a barb on it, and then just use a piece of transmission hose on it, really, 10mm or 12mm transmission hose on it, because it's not carrying any pressure. This is the pressure line here. The other thing that's missing from this that I might have to sort out is there's no heat shielding over these pipes. I have had in a rally car, in my own rally car, this hose burst once before. Admittedly, it was a slightly different power steering line design from the earlier one, but it burst, put power steering fluid all over the turbo, and that went up and caught on fire. Very, very, very luckily, we stopped quick enough and got it out, and luckily it didn't even singe the paint in the engine bay, so I was very, very lucky. Have seen these lines burst and burn cars to the ground. Not so much with standard road cars, although I have heard it happening where people have got a big stainless steel dump pipe on it or a big turbo that generates a lot of heat. But certainly rally cars where anti-lag, where you've got a lot of heat and the turbo can glow bright red under the bonnet, which is what happened with my one. The insulation had actually split off it, and didn't know, and on the back side of where the insulation had split off, the heat had got in there, cooked the hose burst under the high pressure of power steering, especially also under a lot of pressure from in a stage, in a rally as well. It was a very twisty tight stage, and yeah, that resulted in a fire. So these days, generally when we're building rally cars, we won't necessarily use the factory power steering lines. We tend to use some AN fittings and adapters and use braided stainless steel lines, which can cope with the heat. However, again, this application, we want to use as many standard parts as possible, and this hose looks like it's in reasonably good condition, so it'll go back in the car with some heat shielding over it. And also on the version 2 or version 1, version 2s, and I think even the version 3s didn't have a power steering cooler on them unless they were an STI version, so the standard Australian models didn't have that. However, come late 98 onwards, they had this simple loop, which is a power steering cooler. It sits in front of the radiator and behind the grill at the top there, just to get a bit of extra cooling to help cool the power steering fluid down, which is a great idea. That will definitely go in this car. Some of the STI models had a proper radiator in them that look a bit like a transmission cooler radiator for the power steering fluid, which is also a good idea. So, in my left hand here is the version 1 or version 2 power steering pump. As you can see straight up, the tanks are different. Also on the sides of these, the fittings are different. You would have seen when I took the hoses off, this has a banjo type fitting on it. It comes on at 90 degrees, whereas the version 1, the hose came in straight. Also, where the fluid return comes from the rack is different spot as well. This one goes straight into the pot, whereas this one comes into the top, and that has come via the cooler into that. That nut though, on the side there, does not just screw into that. It's a different thread. There's different fittings and bits and pieces in there. There's a valve and a spring behind there from memory, so they're not interchangeable. And also the tanks on the top are not interchangeable as well. They've got a slightly different bolt pattern on the top there. Been through the exercise on many occasions, just trying to swap bits and pieces over to get them to work, and they don't. So what I will be swapping off this is the pulley. Will go on. I'm not sure why that pulley's been taken off, but it's been taken off, and also the mounting bracket. And I'll use this mounting bracket because I know, as I said the other day, these two holes here are supposed to be M8. However, on the block, they had M10 bolts in them. I retapped the block the other day and got that sorted out, and so therefore these holes should be drilled larger to cope with that, so I'll reuse that bracket, and then I know it'll all go on to the version 1 engine without any drama. The pump itself, all the mountings for those are the same, and it'll go straight in. Rightio. Tighten them by hand. Underneath here are seals, and over time they tend to weep, and what happens is then when they start weeping, great, get something to sort all that out now. That's got a bit of dirty fluid inside that. That's yucko. Now, the trick to stop these leaking is to put some sealant around the edge of the tank. So just a nice thin coat. There's actually a groove there that the seal does sit in. But, with the expansion and contraction, the heat and the age, that tends to move and warp, and then the rubber gasket leaks, and then the power steering fluid tends to, well, sometimes it's a weep and sometimes it's a hemorrhage out the side of the power steering pump. So a tiny bit of sealant around there will just help to seal that up. Saves me having to chase down another gasket. Just give it a good coat. Make sure there's some in the groove as well. What I might do now, while I have the opportunity, I may do the seal on the top of this one as well, because it is very common for these tanks to leak. Now this is not the header tank off of a version 1 or version 2. This is off like a 98 or 99, and somebody's made up an aluminium adapter plate to make it fit. That's a very common conversion, because the earlier ones are like aluminium and they've got a crimp, and the crimp fails in the top of it, and then the top tank leaks and they lose their coolant. This was a much better design. However, it uses a rubber gasket, like an O-ring seal in there, and that also a bit the same as this one. They shrink and expand, and then they leak. So whilst I have nothing else to do and I have the sealant out, I will take that top off and do that as well. Alright, let's have a look in here and see what... I have a tight hose now. I don't know if you can see all that in there. It's all the corroded aluminium. That's happened over a number of years, that all that powder builds up in there through lack of use, and also because the whole cooling system's dried out. The other reason that you get so much scale and corrosion in there is there's dissimilar metals, and there's no coolant in it to keep those from electrolysis and corroding with each other, because the top for this is steel and the tank is aluminium. Just wiggle that seal out. Because this has been sitting such a long time, I will put a new radiator cap on this as well. Right, the way to make sure that it's sealed is you can just see a very thin line of sealant squeezing out in the join there. Okay, that's that done. That will do for this afternoon. So I had intended to get a fair bit more done. Unfortunately, just didn't get that far. Sometimes that happens. So that'll do for this episode. Thanks very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you again soon. Cheers.